Hey everybody, and welcome to Skeptic Skeleton Sunday Streams, a thing that I'm going to try to do every Sunday at around 8 o'clock EST, where I give my unedited, unfiltered thoughts on certain videos that I've tried to make responses to, but turn out to be way too long to edit. So, rather than do all of that, I'd rather just have a stream about those videos. And today we're going to talk about the best argument for God's existence, as well as 10 questions for atheists, both of which I felt deserved more than watered down or edited comments. So here we go. Let's start off with the best argument for God's existence. Of course, I am very silly and did not put on screen sharing because, of course, I did. Why wouldn't I? All right, now we can get into it.
I suppose I would be willing to amend the title of this video to my favorite argument for the existence of God.
All right, the video's just started and already I kind of have a bit of a problem. So editing is a thing, and it takes a long time to edit a video and go through it and actually get it finished and uploaded to YouTube. And if it was actually this guy's intention to amend the title, then he would have, but he deliberately didn't. I can't say why, but I find it very odd that you would have a little bit of a clickbait title and then say, well, it's not the best, it's just my favorite, almost as if you doubt the strength of your own argument for some reason.
Because I'm not intellectually capable enough to be able to claim that this is the best or the most logically superior argument for God's existence. And it will certainly suffer from my feeble rendering of it. But of all,
this is not just unique to this person, but this is unique to everybody. Sort of all listening and speaking and communication is interpretation. So it's not really just you, my dude.
All the arguments that I've studied, I find this one to be the most persuasive and convincing.
And how many arguments have you studied? Or are you just going to sort of throw that out there?
Because I think everybody can relate to it. It touches on every single person's experience of life. And
why does it matter whether or not people can relate to it, or whether or not it's a part of their experience or anything of that nature? Why is that relevant to how accurate it is and whether or not it leads you to a correct conclusion, which I presume is what an argument is supposed to do? If your primary concern is with truth, then you should be primarily focused on that and arguments that point in that direction.
And it's also not terribly logical.
And now I have to deal with something. I will be right back. That awkward moment when you tell people that you're going to be doing something and yet they still call you and ask you to do things despite the fact that you told them you were going to be in the middle of doing something. Anyway, where were we?
Complicated, so I think most people can follow it.
Yes, how intuitive an argument is, or how it relates to your experience, and how that's relevant to whether or not it's correct or accurate or valid in any sense.
I also want to admit from the outset that there are reasonable and compelling replies to this argument, as there are to any arguments.
Are you going to mention them? Are you going to mention the replies to the replies? Or are you just going to say in the beginning that this has some compelling replies and then just not go into them almost as if they don't matter, or you just didn't feel like bringing them in?
I sometimes get the impression that for those of us that are invested in content like this, whether it's in books or whether we're watching YouTube videos, that all we need is someone who represents our particular ideological persuasion to say something in reply to someone who has said something in opposition to what it is that we believe. And that as long as someone says something in reply, then we can be consoled that we've gained the upper hand. But
I agree that there are some people that do have this approach, that rather than engaging with ideas themselves, they'll wait until their favorite thinker, YouTuber, or whatever will engage with the topic for them and then feel consoled through that person rather than actually engaging with the idea on their own. However, the entire reason that I created my own YouTube channel was so that I could avoid that exact thing. There are lots of atheists that I'm aware of that have covered this video in particular, but I have things to say on it that I think are unique and I think will add to the conversation. And perhaps I'm wrong, but I think it's important. And I agree with this man in the sense that it is important for everyone to engage with topics and ideas on their own and not just wait for their favorite person or the favorite person on their side to engage with the topic for them.
Just because somebody speaks last doesn't mean they've actually risen to the challenge of dismantling an opposing argument. But again, I will concede that there are good and compelling and intellectually stimulating arguments against the existence of God.
Like?
And if I only ever had the logic of the two positions to go on, I don't think I could ever conclusively decide that one was right and one was wrong beyond a reasonable doubt.
So you're an agnostic then? Excuse me, you're an agnostic atheist then? Because that seems to be the position that you're describing, or that seems to be the line of reasoning that leads to that position sometimes.
But so my hope is that a presentation like this will demonstrate to you that there are rational approaches to the existence of God and that faith can be complemented by reason.
I find that statement odd in particular. Specifically, faith can be complemented by reason. If reason was good enough, then it wouldn't need faith. And if faith was good enough, you wouldn't need reason. I see no reason you would need both of these things. Either they're good enough to get to the correct conclusion consistently, or they are not. If they're good enough on their own, then they don't need each other. And if they're not good enough on their own, combining them isn't going to get you anywhere. If you have something that doesn't prove God's existence and then another thing that doesn't prove God's existence, combining them isn't going to prove God's existence or provide evidence for God's existence, or however you would approach reaching that conclusion correctly rather than just reaching that conclusion.
Even if you've never experienced a preacher or evangelist or a faith community leader taking that approach, my hope is that you will be left with enough of a compelling impression that you'd be willing to explore this a little bit further, both intellectually and experientially.
Experientially meaning what? I don't know what he means by experientially, because I get the impression that you'd have to believe it in order to experience it. And if I don't have to believe it in order to experience it, how does that work?
I said earlier that there are compelling atheistic arguments just as there are theistic arguments.
But for some reason, you're only presenting one of the theistic arguments and none of the atheistic arguments, as well as none of the atheistic replies to this argument that you said were quite compelling. I find it odd that instead of giving us the whole picture, you're only giving us the one argument you think is the best without the rebuttals.
But my experience of experimenting with and exploring the possibility of God's existence is what overwhelmingly tips the scales in that direction.
It is not impossible for one's experience to lead them to the correct conclusion. However, it is also possible for one's experience to lead to an incorrect conclusion. Your experience, even if everything you say is legitimate and true and did happen, is only good enough for you and doesn't do much for anybody else, as well as the fact that it might not be accurate. Between hallucinations, illusions, and just faulty thinking and bad memory, it's very possible for the things we experience to not actually be the way we think that they are. So when you present your experiential evidence, or however you would phrase it, to me, I'm going to ask how you distinguish experiential evidence that is legitimate from experiential evidence that is illegitimate, especially in your case. Yes, I know my device isn't fully protected. Go away.
Because my life has dramatically changed, and I would say improved, since I placed myself in a pattern according to Christian teaching.
Okay, but what does that have to do with the strength of the argument? Why does that make it better? Your life can improve through circumstances outside of your control as well as for faulty reasons. You can improve your life. For example, you might have no money in your bank account, or you might actually have money in your bank account. See, this is the kind of stuff I edit out. You might actually have money in your bank account, but you might believe you have no money in your bank account, which will then motivate you to seek more money and actually put money in your bank account, which ultimately will lead to a higher quality of life because you'll have more money. And then when you discover you had more money than you thought you had, that will lead to an even greater quality of life. However, that does not mean that that is a rational way to approach things. If you try to believe based on what you assume is pragmatic benefit and how it will change your life, I don't know how you tell how it's going to affect your life beforehand. You can only sort of see these things after they happen. So to you, that might be good enough that, hey, it changed my life. But nobody else entering the conversation that doesn't already agree with you is going to take that gamble that it might change their life. Because there are a lot of Christians that do not have great lives right now. And I think they would not say that Christianity has changed their life in the same way that you have. But even if they did, that wouldn't make it right, just to be clear.
And by that, I don't mean that everything has gone my way since then, or that God has answered everything according to the way that I've asked for in prayer. What I do mean is that I've experienced a great deal more joy and hope and peace than I did before.
Okay. Again, assuming all of that is true, what does that have to do with the strength of this particular argument? What does that have to do with whether or not God exists? I don't see how your life improvements in any way lead to or equate to the existence of God.
And that I've endured struggles and distresses that the person I was before really would have struggled to negotiate. And I've also been freed from...
You say the person before would have struggled to negotiate as if you don't still struggle to negotiate things, but you just made it perfectly clear that everything doesn't go your way, which I can only assume means that you struggle sometimes. And if you struggle sometimes, what's the difference between you now and before? Because both of you are struggling with things.
Modes of behavior that I was really ashamed of. And at the end of the day, I've discovered a life that I found incredibly fulfilling because of my openness to those teachings.
Okay, but the teachings can still be wrong and false. And your life isn't over, so those teachings can still lead you down a dark road. Not to mention the fact that you think your life is improved, but from an outside perspective, there are others who would say otherwise. It's very easy to look at your life and say, I am better. I've stopped doing things I didn't want to do. But there are other people that you live with and interact with and in one way or another affect. So it's easy for you to say your life is better, but what about other people's lives? Has your openness to these teachings affected other people's lives in a positive way?
And if you're on the other side of two compelling logical alternatives, shouldn't the one that promises a great deal...
Before we get to that, I'm not willing to grant that they are two compelling logical alternatives because that's not a case that's been sufficiently made to me. So I'm not going to say that these are two logically compelling. I'm not going to put the two on the same pedestal. First of all, I don't believe I have enough knowledge to land hard on one side or the other. But even if I did, I definitely don't think that they're equal, or I see no reason to think that they are equal, and it's just a free toss between theism and atheism.
Deal of hope, logical alternatives, shouldn't the one that promises a great deal of hope and even eternal life create enough incentive for you to start exploring it with more consequence than mere speculation?
No, because the incentives to a particular position have nothing to do with whether or not it's correct. At the end of the day, based on what you've said, you're more willing to believe that the world is full of sunshine and rainbows instead of the world is a cruel, difficult place where people are mean to you and things don't go your way. Because one has hope and promises and gives you an incentive and all that. But none of that has anything to do with whether or not it's true. And the longer this video goes on, the more I get the impression that you don't really care about truth. You care about what sounds good. You care about what makes you feel good. You care about the carrot at the end of the stick rather than the truth going on around you. And that can be very, very dangerous. Someone can very easily manipulate your desire for incentives for their own gain, and you will be none the wiser because you don't care whether or not what they're saying is true. You care whether or not they promise you the fancy things.
Because if it's a toss-up at the end of the day,
which I'm not willing to grant that it is,
I think it makes a lot of rational sense to bet on the possibility of God's existence.
Why?
And to start searching for him more earnestly.
Are we supposed to do that in that order? Because if I'm betting on God's existence, then I already believe in God, and that's putting the cart before the horse. Also, you haven't given a definition of God, so how do I know what I'm supposed to be looking for? I haven't heard a definition of God yet that makes any sense to me that I can understand. So how am I supposed to look for something when I don't know what it is?
Every single person that I've said that to who took me up on that challenge was not disappointed. And
so what? I don't know how many people you've said that to. I don't know if if you're telling me the truth. And I also don't know if these people didn't have a bias coming in that would alter that. This is a similar thing I hear from some Christians who want you to believe first and then you'll see all the evidence, which again is putting the cart before the horse. If I'm willing to believe without all the evidence, then I don't need the evidence. If you're telling me to believe first and then I'll get the evidence, then I don't need the evidence because I'll just believe. The entire point of needing the evidence is for the purpose of belief. And if you switch the two around, then you're not following the evidence to where it leads. You're trying to lead the evidence to where you are already.
And I don't think you will be either.
But what if I am? You see the problem with having this be contingent upon other people's disappointment is, what if I am disappointed? What if I do whatever it is you're trying to say I should do, and on the other side of it, I'm disappointed? Does that invalidate all the other people? No, I don't think it does. Does that automatically make you wrong? I don't think it does. And unless you think that my disappointment makes you wrong, then I don't see how their lack of disappointment makes you right.
I want to start out by setting the stage between two alternatives and to emphasize that you can't have it both ways, which is what too many of us try to get away with. The first option says that the physical universe with its cosmos, planets, living things, matter, and the physical laws that govern those things is all that there is. And so that any intellectual inquiry into truth or what is real should be limited to the scope of the physical sciences.
I would say that is a particularly strong version of materialism, and I would not go as far as to say that is a position that I particularly accept. And I'm not necessarily convinced that that's what most materialists would say either. It's not that we know for a fact that this is all that there is, so there's no point in even bothering to investigate anything else. This is our starting point. This is what we know to begin with. It is a matter of we don't know what's beyond this universe or if beyond this universe even makes sense. But all we know is we got a universe. All we know is we're here and there's physical stuff all over the place. Anything beyond that requires further investigation and cannot be our starting point. So I am not necessarily convinced that this is a position that most materialists hold. There are those that stringently stay to that there is only the material and nothing else. But I think that the position is more nuanced than that. And I think it's a matter of this is as far as the limits of our knowledge have taken us is to the physical. And anything beyond that is simply we don't have any evidence for, we don't have any understanding of. But since that's the case, given that this is what we're doing, it's also important to note that we have no good reason to go outside these boundaries. If we have a basis of knowledge, being science and the physical and matter and things of that nature, we have no good reason to just all of a sudden go look for the supernatural or go look for the immaterial. It just seems random to go outside of the scope of our knowledge completely, not even tangentially, but completely, for seemingly no good reason, and to start looking for something immaterial when we have no good reason to think that anything immaterial exists, and we don't have an understanding of what it would mean for something immaterial to exist, as if that's not a contradiction in terms.
The second option acknowledges the physical universe and everything I just described, but it broadens the scope of reality to include that which exceeds the physical universe.
What do you mean exceeds the physical universe? I presume exceeds usually includes something and then goes beyond it. So whatever this thing is at least partially physical or partially material, whatever it is you're trying to describe in this second option.
And it's fixed. And it recognizes that we have many experiences that indicate that there is far more than those fixed laws. So
our experiences are not a good basis on which to decide if there's anything beyond the physical laws, because our experiences can be deceptive, can be false, and can be the result of physical laws or things that we are not aware of. So again, appealing to experience is a bad example, because then that validates the experience of anyone who's basically had any experience they said was not physical, and gives it some sort of validity for some reason. I see no reason to trust your experience in this regard when it goes against what we understand and what we know in the sense of it being physical things. If we know physical things to some degree, and your experience indicates something that's non-physical things, and by physical I mean material, non-material things, I see no reason to trust your experience versus what you know.
But to start exploring those two options, consider the fact that every human society that we have records for, every civilization, has nurtured some sort of moral code of behavior.
Not exactly. I don't know how you came to that conclusion, and I get the distinct impression that that's something you just said rather than something you actually looked up and researched, because I can't find any citations for it. And for those who are actual skeptics, here we are. And I have not seen any particular citations for it. A lot of words, but no real links, no articles, no nothing like that. And anyone who doubts my scrolling can always go to the video themselves and get the full context and look for themselves. But the point here is that I'm not convinced that that's the case. Moral codes and moral laws mean different things to different people, and to make broad assumptions about societies in general with no evidence is very dangerous and stupid.
And in many cases, like the entire developed world of today, those societies recognize the most critical aspects of that moral code in laws that inflicted punitive measures on anyone who transgressed that moral code.
No, that's not how that works. Do you think that we in the good old US of A have, for example, jaywalking as being illegal for any giant moral reason? Because the thing is, right, there are different people with different moral codes, but only some of them are made into laws. So you have to account for that. You have to account for the fact that we have various citizens with various moral codes, but we have a very strict set of laws that some people agree with and some people disagree with. How do you determine what's the actual moral law or the objective moral law, whatever that means? And why do you think that laws have some sort of moral source, we'll say, rather than a pragmatic source? It is my understanding that we make things illegal and enact punitive measures as a deterrent to particular behaviors and activities that would otherwise denigrate our society or our society's goals. If our society has a goal of minimizing the amount of dead people we have, then it is in our best interest to make murder illegal. Now, people are still going to do it, but we can enact punitive measures in order to deter others from doing it and possibly lower the number of murders overall. Instead of just we made it legal because we felt like it was the right thing to do, which doesn't seem to have any actual implications. It doesn't seem to have any actual effect on its own. It's just, I did it because I felt like it was the right thing to do, rather than I did it because it actually enhances this specific goal. I'm not convinced that that's the way societies form their laws. Which, while we're on the subject of that, why do different societies have different laws? How can there be any overlapping universal moral code when different societies have different laws, and then within those societies, different citizens have different moral opinions, some of which are law and some of which are not? How do we get this vast variety of moral opinions when there are only certain moral laws? And what happens when certain moral laws are not enacted, because there are some places that have more laws than others? So if in America we have murder laws, but somewhere else there are no murder laws and they have other laws, then what? How do you explain that in the framework that you've presented?
No matter how much we philosophize and speculate about the existence of a universal code of moral behavior and try to liberate ourselves from it by claiming that there is no such thing, there's
Whoa. Why do you think that claiming there is no such thing is the same thing as trying to liberate yourself from it? If I claim that the police don't exist, I know full well that that's not going to liberate me from the police or from the law. Claiming the non-existence of something, as far as I can tell, is no means of liberating yourself from it. So why do you think that that's a strategy that one would employ? Why do you think that we would say, well, we know there's a moral law, we just don't want to be bothered with it, so we're just going to say it doesn't exist? This also implies that we know there's a moral law rather than we just don't, and we just don't think that there is one. I really want to know how you got to that conclusion that that's what you think the vast majority, or at least a significant portion of the conversation surrounding morality even is.
only what we happen to prefer.
If morality is not what you happen to prefer, then what is it? Because you're going to have to define it and explain it in some way that I can understand in order for us to move forward. Because that's my understanding of it. It is essentially you evaluating whether or not something maximizes or minimizes your values. And in that regard, it is subjective. And I don't understand how there can be any overarching sense of what maximizes your values when you are a subject, and this varies from subject to subject. So if that's not what you mean, if that's not what you're describing when you talk about morality, then you're going to have to describe what you are talking about. Otherwise, we have a word with no definition here.
Everybody I know has tried to hold somebody else to some measurable standard of right and wrong.
Yes, and it was probably a standard that they preferred.
Everyone has objected when someone has wronged them, when they've cheated them or lied to them.
Everyone has objected when they think they have been wronged. It is not merely the case that everyone objects when they've been wronged. There are abuse victims, victims of Stockholm Syndrome, who do not object when they're being wronged. And there are also individuals who are overly sensitive who object when they have, in fact, not been wronged. So it's not merely the case that everyone who's been wronged objects, because that's not universally true. Some people do and some people don't. And this variety is the reality that you have to account for in your definition. This definition that you're providing, that is supposed to be true and accurate to reality, has to encompass the facts of reality, like some people are easily offended and they react to what they think is them being wronged or what they think is them being cheated. Those things, wronged, cheated, betrayed, anything of those natures, are subjective words subject to anyone's individual interpretation. So I don't understand how we can all, or how all the people you've ever met do this thing, even though this thing is subjective. This is akin to saying everyone eats their favorite food, but their favorite food is obviously going to vary depending on who you talk to. So there is no the favorite food. There are just different people's favorite foods. And the same goes for morality.
Or abuse them. And nobody would be satisfied with the retort, just because you don't like what somebody did to you doesn't mean it's actually wrong.
Whether or not they would be satisfied has nothing to do with whether or not that is the correct response and the truth. You might not be satisfied with a lot of things, but that doesn't make it untrue. I'm not satisfied with the existence of this video. That doesn't make it go away, and that doesn't make it any easier to respond to. The individual's satisfaction to a response has nothing to do with how true the response is, which again should be the primary concern. If the primary concern isn't truth, then what is it? For you, at least. I know what the primary concern is for me, but if it's not truth, then what is it for you? And if it is truth, this is not an effective way to achieve that end, to get to truth, to evaluate things based on how satisfied people are with responses.
That's just your preference. If good and bad is just a way of describing what you or I happen to prefer, then we would never have grounds to say that someone else should behave according to those preferences.
Objectively speaking, yes, that's correct. What's the problem?
We could never hold someone else accountable for their behavior because...
No, we could very easily hold them accountable to their behavior from our perspective. You don't need some objective moral law in order to force your moral preferences on others or hold people accountable under your moral perception. So, this is why people who do not agree with laws are still arrested by laws. This is why people who might not agree with someone's sexuality still have to deal with people who disagree with them. It is not just the case that, well, if it's not an objective moral thing, then nobody can push it onto other people. But plenty of people do that all the time. Assuming that's what you mean by hold people responsible for, which I'm not 100% sure that's what you mean, but that's the only thing I can imagine. Usually when I mean to hold someone responsible, it is, as you said before, to enact punitive measures as a deterrent. However, people don't need any sort of objective grounding or anything to enact punitive measures against others. This is how a lot of crimes tend to happen, particularly violent crimes, is someone for one reason or another is holding their views on other people and phone alarm. They're holding their views and holding other people responsible for their views. And thus, if they're an atheist, they might get kicked out of their family. If they're gay, they might get kicked out of the family. And they don't care whether or not, even though they probably think they do have some great moral ground, they don't care about that. It's not necessary in order to enact that punishment onto others.
In order to do so, you have to concede that there is something objective and something neutral outside and apart from our preferences that mediates between us.
No, I don't. I can enact my moral preferences on you right now. For example, I think it is immoral to have long hair. You have a healthy amount of hair on your head. Therefore, you are a healthy degree of immoral, and I'm holding you responsible for this by telling you and expecting you to change. I didn't need any objective, neutral thing to do that. I just did it. Now, whether or not you comply with it is an entirely separate issue, but I don't need it in order to hold you responsible. Now, you might not care about me holding you responsible. You might not comply with being held responsible, but that doesn't mean that I'm not holding you responsible.
So that I can hold you accountable and you can hold me accountable. When
a better example would be public cases that people tend to disagree with. Public cases where the public has a different verdict than the courts. In that case, the public has a perception of someone and holds them accountable to that perception and acts and treats that person as if they committed the crime or did not commit the crime, depending on the public opinion. And this is not necessary, or this does not require some neutral objective, whatever you're trying to describe. It doesn't require anything of that nature. It just requires people to enforce their preferences in one way or another on other people. And I fail to see how you need something neutral in order to do that.
Either of us mistreats the other. And no matter what anybody says,
when someone says, no matter what anybody says, this is a strong indicator that someone is not interested in the truth, because you have not merely assumed a position, you have firmly planted yourself in that position and simply refuse to move regardless of what evidence comes your way. And that is remarkably bad. I don't understand how you can see that and think that that's a good thing, or see that and think that that is a good idea, to just plant your feet in the ground that way and just refuse to move under any circumstances. So I don't know. I genuinely don't understand. I don't understand how a person can say something along those lines of no matter what anyone says, because someone can say something true, accurate, and reasonable, and you've just stated that you simply will ignore them. How, again, is this supposed to help you get to truth? And if truth isn't your goal, then what is your goal?
or what philosophy you subscribe to, all of us recognize this requirement, and all of our laws.
I don't recognize this requirement. I just clearly explained why I don't recognize this requirement. I can hold you responsible for something without any objective sense. There are abusive parents who hold their children to what most would consider abusive standards, and they don't need any objective, neutral, mutual agreement in order to hold their children responsible for ridiculous things.
Laws are premised upon this truth. Otherwise, all you would have to judge right and wrong are preferences, and then you would have no grounds to say that someone's preferences outweigh someone else's preferences.
Yes, and what's the problem? You say that like it is a bad thing, but you don't demonstrate why it's an inaccurate thing. You're not demonstrating why that's not accurate to reality. You're just like, but that's bad and I don't like it. If morality is only preferences, then nobody can objectively say anybody is objectively morally wrong or right, and we can't objectively hold people responsible. And I don't understand what the problem with all that is. You seem to just reject the idea out of some sense of you don't like it, rather than there's something inconsistent or factually inaccurate about it.
Such that your preferences to not have your things stolen or to not be abused carry no more weight than someone else's preference to steal your things or to abuse you.
Okay, why do I care about the weight of each person's preference? Why is that a relevant factor to me when deciding or coming to a conclusion on what my preferences are? If I'm trying to prevent my things from being stolen, why do I care whether or not the other person has grounds to steal my things or not? Why is that a factor at all? Why should that be a factor at all? I don't see how this is relevant to the way that people live their lives, and I don't see how this actually is mirrored in reality, because most people don't care if you can come up with a fancy smancy philosophical argument for why you should steal their things. And I'm fairly certain that if someone tried to have a philosophical conversation with you about why they should steal your things, and if they could demonstrate that they had more weight to steal your things than you had weight to not have your things stolen, I don't think you would then just let them steal your things, because stealing presumably goes against your values. And if it does go against your values, regardless of whether or not someone has greater grounds, whatever that means, you're going to promote what maximizes your values and be against or denigrate what goes against those values, at least as far as I can tell.
Unless there truly is an objective moral standard that we can appeal to judge our disputes and to hold each other accountable to. And
what objective moral standard do you hold when trying to dispute against someone who's trying to murder you? Or do you not take that into account and you just defend yourself? Because I get the distinct impression that if someone is trying to harm you in an immediate fashion, that person doesn't care about any objective moral grounds. They're doing what their preference is without regard to that. They didn't bother to have that conversation with you beforehand. And I doubt you would try to have that conversation with them in that moment, and that you would try to appeal to some objective standard or whatever in the face of an immediate threat. In the face of an immediate threat, I get the impression that you would do what maximizes your value of staying alive and minimizes what you and minimizes the possibility of that value not being maximized. So I think you're going to go with what helps your values or what hurts your values. I don't think you're going to go with, well, before you murder me, let me appeal to this moral standard. Because even if you could do that, if someone doesn't care, this does you no good. At the end of the day, whether or not there is an objective moral standard really doesn't affect most people's behaviors and actions. At the end of the day, most people are not going to stop and reconsider their actions because something is objectively morally correct. If that was the case, I doubt anybody would ever do anything that they thought or they thought others thought was wrong. Everyone would just act the same because there would just be this overarching moral law. But because there isn't, or if there is, it has no impact on their behavior, they can merely disregard it and do whatever they want. Even if objective morality exists, most people are still going to go with their preferences. If it was objectively moral to harm your neighbor, I would like to think you would still not do it, and that you would decide what to do without regard to what was objectively correct or not. Or would you just harm your neighbor because it's objectively moral to do so, whatever that means?
And the fact that we have laws concedes this fact that this moral standard does exist.
Okay, but then why do different counties have different laws, different states have different laws, different countries have different laws, different societies have different laws? This doesn't make sense when you take into account the vast majority of laws, especially laws that might be or seem contradictory, especially the presence of laws in one place and the absence of laws in others. If there isn't a law somewhere, does that mean it's not immoral there? Does that affect the morality? Does the presence or lack thereof have any effect on the existence of morality? Because if it does, then morality just exists in different places for different periods of time. And if it doesn't, all this stuff you're talking about laws doesn't make any sense and has nothing to do with morality. But you have to pick a side. It is either dependent on the law's existence or it isn't. If it's dependent on the law's existence, then it's not independent. It's not objective. It's dependent on the law's existence, and it depends on which law is in what place for what period of time. And if it's not dependent on the law's existence, stop appealing to laws to demonstrate your point because they don't matter.
But what are the implications of that? What are we talking about? What are we allowing when we talk about morality?
Now you're going to define morality. I really think you should have done that at the beginning of the video, but okay, let's see what you got.
Well, morality can be described as a judgment against what ought to occur and what actually occurs.
What do you mean by ought to occur? And if you say, well, what should occur, then my question is, what do you mean by what should occur? I don't understand what ought and should refer to, except that they are subjective evaluations of particular circumstances. Let me just hold on for 1 second. I just want to check something. And no one's in the chat. Cool. Just wanted to make sure. So I'm still confused. I don't understand why. I don't understand how this is necessarily relevant to the discussion.
For example, if somebody abuses their wife, we would be correct in saying you ought not to have done that.
Okay, and how do we know that? How do we know that we would be correct in saying that they ought not have done that? How do you demonstrate that? How do you prove that? This is the question that I'm asking and that I've been asking from the beginning. It's very easy for you to say we'd be correct, but how do you prove we're correct? And what difference does it make whether or not we are correct? That doesn't stop the wife beater. It usually means that we have to enact some sort of punitive measure on that person. Just being correct and having objective morality and saying what ought to be the case and what ought not to be the case doesn't do anything and has no effect on reality. It's only when there's actually some action put into it that it actually affects reality.
We're saying that the actions and decisions that led to that abuse were the wrong ones.
What do you mean by the wrong ones?
As compared to the right ones.
What do you mean by the right ones? And how do you know which one is right or wrong? You haven't given a definition of right or wrong, so we can't compare it and say it's right or say it's wrong because you haven't told us what right or wrong is, except it's what should be and what shouldn't be, whatever that means.
We're evaluating what happened
subjectively. We are subjects subjectively evaluating something.
In this case, the abuse, and we're comparing it to what ought to have happened, what should have happened.
And how do you come to a conclusion on what ought have happened or what should have happened? How do we achieve that objective moral knowledge if it is indeed there to be achieved? Because right now you're saying that's what we're doing, but you're not describing the process.
And saying that what actually happened should not have happened.
And how do we know if it should not have happened or not?
And that the one who is guilty of committing the abuse is to some degree responsible and culpable for what happened.
Okay, I guess, but I don't think that necessarily matters. We can say that they're responsible and culpable, but again, that on its own doesn't do much. We need actual force and actual punitive measures. Just holding them responsible and telling them they did a bad thing doesn't really do much. And again, I don't see why you need some neutral objective standard to do what you just did.
Now, it's important to pause and recognize that the natural sciences as a method of inquiry cannot tell us anything about what ought to happen as compared to what actually happens.
Yes.
The natural sciences are limited to consideration about the natural universe and are predicated on the assumption that the natural universe behaves according to fixed laws.
Does the natural universe not behave according to fixed laws? By every observation and every piece of evidence that I can tell, it does.
And by fixed laws, we mean what always happens. For example,
that's not necessarily what fixed laws means. Fixed laws means what always happens, assuming the variables are exactly the same. For example, 2 plus 2 will always equal 4 because the variables will always be the same and the process will always be the same. But if you change the variables, so you have 4 plus 2, you will not get 4. You will get 6 because the variables have changed. Or if you change the process and say 2 minus 2, you will get 0 because, again, the process has changed as well. So fixed laws is not necessarily what always happens. Fixed laws is what always happens, assuming the variables and the processes are the same. If everything can be accounted for, the exact same thing should happen every single time. And to say should is to say that it is expected to happen every single time in the exact same way because the variables will lead to the same conclusion. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4 every single time as long as 2 is being added to 2. If you change anything about that, then the result changes. So fixed laws are not always what happens. They're just what happens, assuming all the circumstances are the same.
The law of gravity describes what happens when two bodies of mass come within proximity to each other. There's no option to choose something outside of the laws that we're describing.
What? What does that have to do with anything? What does something being a fixed law have to do with whether or not you can choose to ignore it?
A planet can't break faith with its orbit because it wants to go somewhere else.
But it can break faith with its orbit if something else were to collide with it or some other event were to happen. Again, if the variables were to change, then the circumstances can change. No choice involved. And I don't even understand why you brought choice into this.
But remember, morality tells us what should happen and not necessarily what always does happen.
Okay, but you still haven't described what should means. So when you say something should happen, I don't know what that means.
Whereas science only tells us what does happen. It makes observations of what happens, and then it draws conclusions from those observations.
Okay, so science tells us the truth of the matter, And morality tells us what? What we think the truth of the matter should have been? How is that helpful in any way? How do you test if that's even true or not? Why would I want what the truth should have been as opposed to what the truth is?
But if all there is the natural universe, then there's no grounds for talking about what should happen, only what does happen.
Exactly. Beyond our preferences, that is. Exactly. That's correct. What's the problem?
And you and I, as fixtures of that natural universe, are also inevitably bound to those same fixed laws.
Yes, exactly. What's the problem?
But with you and I, we notice that there's more going on than just fixed laws.
Do we?
We have an intellect and a will that governs the things that we do.
Again, do we? Intellect and will are words defined by us, and again mean different things to different people. So it's very easily for you to say we have a will and an intellect, but you haven't defined what those are or what you mean by those. And even if you did, I'm not necessarily willing to concede that I have what you think is an intellect. I mean, you certainly don't seem to have what I would consider an intellect, but as far as will goes, I don't know how you determine that either.
We can choose between alternatives, and because
Can we? I don't think that we can. I think you think we can, but this goes back to what I was rambling about when I came to 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's not, as far as I can tell, it's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of variables. Presumably, any choice that you make has some kind of reasoning behind it. Even if the reasoning is random and illogical, it's there. And that causes your actions. That causes you to choose one thing over another. And that seems to fit perfectly with our deterministic laws. And that doesn't really seem like much of a choice. If your choices are determined by reason, they're determined. They're not really choices. In the same way that a ball doesn't have the choice whether it goes up or down the hill, that's dictated by the variables, the laws, and things like that. It's not that the ball chose to go down the hill. It's that given the circumstances, it had no other option, so it just did. In the same way, given the circumstances, we just choose things. Again, 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's not that it chooses to equal 4 or that it could equal 8. That's just the truth of the matter. You chose to make this YouTube video for a reason, and that reason determined your choice and led to the creation of this video. It was not a matter of, I just feel like it, so I'm going to do it. There was nothing behind it, and then it just happened. Something determined it and brought this video, for lack of a better phrase, into existence.
Because of this ability, we recognize that we are responsible for the outcomes and the effects that we create through our will.
Not necessarily. Even if we didn't have a choice in the matter, I would still argue that we would still be responsible in a causal sense. Like, regardless of whether you choose to do something or not, it's going to have an effect on other things. And in that sense, you would be responsible, as in you would be the source or you would be the cause. But other than that, again, if by be responsible, you mean held accountable to what should have been or should not have been, we run back into the problem of you not describing what that even means.
We don't hold other natural elements or phenomena responsible for their actions. Like if a
Yes, and do you know why?
tsunami crashes ashore and kills hundreds of people, we don't denounce the ocean for its transgressions. We don't set up protests on shorelines and say, you need to recognize our human rights and dignity. And we certainly don't say, you shouldn't have done that. And the reason we don't do that is because we recognize that the ocean and everything that contributed to that disaster was behaving according to inevitable, deterministic, fixed laws.
Just like us? Are we immune to the laws that the ocean is vulnerable to? What laws exactly are we immune to and don't determine our choices? Because as far as I can tell, all of them play a part. All of them have a role. 2 does not necessarily determine 4, but 2 plus 2 does. When all of the laws and the variables come together, they end up giving a deterministic result. And I don't see why we are any different from the ocean, at least in the way that you described. And as far as I can tell, the reason why we don't protest the ocean is because we understand that we cannot enact punitive measures against it as a deterrent to other oceans from engaging with that same behavior. If some of the Roman or some of the Greek gods existed and they were responsible for natural disasters, we would hold them responsible to whatever degree we could, because we could enact punitive measures on them and ergo deter other gods from engaging in similar behaviors. However, if those gods existed and simply were, however, whatever this means, outside of the universe and outside of our scope, we couldn't do anything about it. We couldn't hold them responsible. We might make subjective evaluations of it being bad, but it doesn't really do anything. So I guess the main point is that we don't do what we do to humans to the ocean because we can't punish the ocean and prevent it from causing more tsunamis. Whereas if we could do that, regardless of whether or not the ocean had agency, if there was a way to punish the ocean and prevent it from creating more tsunamis, we absolutely would. If there was a way to hold the ocean responsible, regardless of whether or not it had agency in the matter, if we could stop it, we absolutely would. But we can't, which is why we don't.
Of the natural universe. But when a person behaves in ways that we don't like, we don't say, "Oh, he's just behaving according to the fixed laws of nature."
That's what I say.
No, we say he is responsible for those decisions because he is governed by more than those fixed laws.
I don't know what more than those fixed laws means, but that is beside the point, and that is not why I hold individuals responsible. If someone commits a murder, I don't hold them responsible because they're beyond physical fixed natures or whatever. I hold them responsible because A, I don't believe I have a choice in the matter, and B, what they have done goes against my values. And to not hold them responsible would be to minimize my value by allowing a murderer to walk free without suffering any sort of punitive measures. So, again, there's a more pragmatic basis for morality than I think you're willing to consider. And I can't speak for anybody else, which is why I've just been speaking for myself this whole time. But I really don't think you've considered the possibility that anyone else can conceive of morality differently than you and that you could possibly be wrong. Because so far, you've only talked about what you think is correct, but you haven't mentioned any of those ever so brilliant responses you said that could be brought up to these points.
He has some agency and ability outside of those fixed laws, and that he is free from those fixed laws to some degree. But if
whether or not he's free from the fixed laws doesn't matter. Whether or not he can be punished and this action can be prevented, that's what matters. Because even if he is free from these fixed laws, if we can neither stop him nor punish him, then in what sense are we holding him responsible besides finger wagging, basically?
The natural universe can only be described within that understanding of those laws and cause and effect, but we either inherit or produce a quality that breaks free.
Does it break free? Nothing you've said thus far indicates that people break free from those fixed laws. All you said is people seem to be able to make choices, which I don't see how that in any way indicates that they break free from natural laws. What natural law are we breaking free from when we make a choice?
From those laws and that sequence, then we have to admit that we found something that is pervasive in the human experience.
There are a lot of false things pervasive in the human experience as well, just to put that out there.
And which exceeds or transcends the natural universe.
How? What do you mean when you say it transcends? How is it exceeding the natural universe? What exactly is being exceeded? What exactly is being transcended? You haven't described what exactly this thing is and how exactly it transcends whatever it's supposed to transcend. You're just saying we have this thing that we produce that transcends this other thing, whatever any of that's supposed to mean.
In other words, there is something that is morality that is
There is something that you call morality,
relentlessly available to our perception and to our experience.
To yours, but not so much to mine, at least not as you've described it.
That portrays something more to reality than what we can see, taste, and touch. There's something.
There are lots of things that portray things about reality incorrectly. Is that a possibility you've considered?
Metaphysical and spiritual in our experience.
Okay, now this is the Hail Mary portion of the video where he just brings up spirituality and brings up the metaphysical, whatever those are supposed to mean, as explanations. Even if I grant everything you've said thus far as completely valid and sound, how did we get to the spiritual? How did we get to the metaphysical? Or are those just labels that you're coming up with to describe this thing we don't really know anything about?
And it's a big part of our experience. In other words, this something more, goodness and morality, was
goodness, morality. I don't even. I'm legitimately speechless, and that never happens. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that doesn't happen.
Always characterized as a transcendental in classical thought. It transcends the natural universe.
Meaning what? How does it transcend the natural universe? How does goodness transcend the natural universe? How is it not affected by the natural universe when it seems to me that goodness wouldn't exist without the natural universe? And if goodness could exist without any natural universe at all, what would it even refer to? It can't refer to what should happen or what ought to happen because there is nothing for which it could happen. So I don't understand this definition of goodness, or rather transcends.
And if we're going to know or understand anything about it, we need to broaden our narrow-minded scope to admit and to...
Broadening your scope and admitting to something are two different things. Admission is saying that you know it, or it is coming clean, or in some way exposing a hidden belief, or some sort of deliberately hidden belief. And I see no valid reason to admit something that I don't think is true. I see no valid reason that we have to admit something in order to broaden our scopes. I can broaden my scope by having this conversation with you, but that doesn't mean I've admitted anything.
To explore metaphysical or spiritual reality.
What is a metaphysical or a spiritual reality? How can we do that if we don't even understand what these things are? And if you understand what these things are, then please share with the rest of the class.
So now that we can understand that there is something, the moral standard or the law of right and wrong.
We don't have that understanding. You got to that understanding somehow. I still haven't been able to figure out how, I guess, because you have a lot of people that you know who make subjective evaluations that you agree with, and they wouldn't be satisfied with answers otherwise. I'm legitimately trying to piece together how you're trying to represent this as a chain of thought, and I'm really struggling.
That transcends the natural universe. What does that tell us about what lies beyond physical nature?
I'm not convinced anything lies beyond physical nature, nor am I convinced that anything transcends it, whatever that means. What does it even mean for something to lie beyond the physical nature?
It tells us that whatever lies beyond is intensely interested in our behavior.
What? How did you get to that conclusion? How did you get to the conclusion that whatever lies beyond the physical nature, because morality objectively exists, whatever lies beyond the physical nature, regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with morality, it intensely cares about us?
In right and wrong, in unselfishness and justice.
Okay, and where did these things come from? If you want to say that they're innate and they're just there and they just never were created, then you're going to have to demonstrate that. Otherwise, you're going to have to show a source for these things, and I don't understand how that source could be anything other than a subject, in the sense that I'm referring to these terms: justice, goodness, morality, whatever.
It seems to be instructing us and becoming more moral by affirming us in our good behavior and making us feel uncomfortable or ashamed about our bad behavior.
This is why every criminal in jail always feels bad about their behavior, because they broke the moral law that was actually a law that we made a law, right? This is why you and I are affirmed and discouraged by the exact same things. And the things that make one person feel bad always necessarily makes the other person feel bad, except for all the times that it doesn't. Because now the way you're describing it and the way the reality appears to function are in conflict, because different people are affirmed by different things. Some people are affirmed by things that other people would be discouraged by. And you have to explain how that's possible, how something can be instructing us to do contradictory things and be affirmed by contradictory things and be discouraged by contradictory things. Or do you just think that there is no contradiction in what people are affirmed by and what other people are discouraged by?
The only thing we can compare it to is a mind.
How? Or, excuse me, I've skipped a step. What is a mind? Are we going to get to that? Because that's also a point of contention.
With will and purpose.
Nothing that you've said so far indicates that it has a will or purpose. It doesn't even affect reality or even do anything. It just sort of kind of makes mild suggestions. People can very easily break free from it, so it doesn't really do anything. How can you say it has a will when it doesn't really affect reality in any way? Or if it does affect reality in some way, how? Because as far as I can tell, we're under no obligation to follow it. It doesn't make anything do anything else. It's just sort of there. And sometimes things follow it and sometimes they don't, almost as if it's not there at all.
And intention. We can't talk about matter as if it's guiding or instructing us. And we certainly can't talk about it like a natural law, because as we've already seen, natural laws don't give allowances for us to disobey.
Okay. Now think about this for a second. Right. You said we can't talk about matter that way. Right. What are we humans, or me, a skeleton, made up of? Matter. So I'm just saying, how did we get to that conclusion? Now, I am not saying that just because the parts can't do something, that means that the whole can't do something. I understand that just because one brick isn't a house doesn't mean you can't build a house of bricks. But I want to know where that line is crossed. How much matter, or in what arrangement of matter, do we need to be where will arises, where we can start to speak about that? Why is it that you treat matter fundamentally differently than you treat humans? And I understand that there is a difference, but I don't understand the difference in this context of why one can be held responsible and the other can't, even though one is made up of the other.
And the fact that we can disobey and aren't forced to conform ourselves to these moral instructions, that tells us a little bit more, I believe.
Does it? It tells me that it doesn't have an objective effect on reality. You made it very clear we can't just choose to disobey gravity, for example, but we can choose to disobey this law, almost as if it's not even there.
It makes love, or the free gift of self, possible. Like, what good are marriage vows if the one reciting them is forced to do so?
To me, a marriage vow is more valuable if it is not, shall we say, random. If it is determined by overwhelming feelings of love that one cannot help but have, that seems more valuable than arbitrarily choosing to do this on this particular day with an equal possibility of being able to arbitrarily choose to do something different. So, to me, love is more valuable when it cannot help but be given rather than it arbitrarily being given. Because at the end of the day, those are ultimately the only two options. Either love is determined by something or it's not determined by anything. And if it's not determined by anything, it's random and arbitrary. And if it's determined by something, it's not freely given. And to me, something that is determined is more valuable in under that framework than something that is freely given, because something that is determined seems more genuine than something that is arbitrary, which may still be genuine in that moment, but is far less stable. And I don't know why you would want the less stable of the two options when something being determined is more stable. But what we want isn't really relevant to what's true anyway. So,
and what good is a promise if it can't be broken?
I would argue that it's better if it can't be broken. I don't think people make promises and find value in the promise that it could be broken. I think they make the promise usually with the hope that it won't be broken. And it's not a matter of the person choosing not to, it's a matter of the promise being fulfilled. Now, this depends on what the promise is, and I can't think of every scenario of a promise right now, but I can't really conceive of a promise where the value of that promise would be in the ability to not fulfill it rather than it actually being fulfilled. I say that to say I think people care more about the promise actually coming true rather than they do the possibility of it not coming true.
Requires its significance because it doesn't have to be given.
But if it doesn't have to be given and there is nothing compelling it to be given, then where's the value? It's arbitrary, it's random. Yes, it doesn't have to be here, but how does that make it valuable?
That's what makes it so amazing when someone chooses to love us.
Again, how is that amazing? You're saying it's amazing, which is all well, good, fine, and dandy, but how is it actually?
So this power behind the moral law, it doesn't impose, it doesn't force the moral law.
At what point did you imply that this thing has power behind moral law? If it has power behind moral law, are you saying that it created the moral law? Then this thing seems kind of like a subject coming up with subjective instructions. And if that's not what's happening, I can't tell the difference between what you're describing and a subject creating instructions and preferences and all that.
On us, and it makes love possible, which leads us to a very...
It makes your definition of love possible, but your definition of arbitrary, random, undetermined love seems less valuable to me.
Personal perception of whatever it is that lies beyond the natural universe. Now, a quick house cleaning item before we wrap up. This narrative and argument isn't designed to consider or assert anything specific about God.
Yes, it is. You very clearly mentioned it's metaphysical, it's spiritual, it's not bound by reality, it transcends reality. I guess, because it's the power behind morality, it transcends morality as well. It gives us instructions. It's interested in our behavior. You've made a lot of very specific claims about what you call God. So you can't at the end try to wrap up and say this doesn't say anything about God itself when you just finished saying all of these different things about God itself.
It's not meant to propose Christianity or any other theological framework. It's only designed to assert the existence of God.
And it does that very poorly. It hasn't even really defined what a God is even supposed to be, except a thing that transcends reality and transcends morality and cares about us and gives us instructions somehow. And yeah, other than that, I don't understand your conception of God. If there's anything else you've said about God, then you're going to have to describe it in a much better sense. You can't assert the existence of something without actually defining that thing, or you can't do so and expect people to be able to understand you.
And nothing else. Anything else you'd want to say about God would have to be considered in another set of arguments.
Yes, like it's the power behind morality. It's metaphysical. It's spiritual. It's not bound by reality, and so on and so forth. I'm glad you understand that, but didn't bother to actually do that in the video.
So all I've done here is followed a logical sequence of premises which...
And which logical sequence of premises were those? Because I'm not even convinced you kept up with your own logic here, let alone me.
Draw the conclusion that there is something that exceeds or is outside the natural universe.
Whatever that means. And those as you mentioned, are their own sets of arguments that have to be made, but you didn't bother making them because, of course, not.
which is deeply concerned with our moral behavior.
Which is an argument that you would have to make, but you have not.
And with all of those variables combined, is best described or is most reminiscent of a mind.
Best described meaning what? How many descriptions have you gone through to determine that this was the best one? Or is this just the one that you like the most?
Thank you so much for watching that. I really hope that you enjoyed it and you got something out of it.
See, I told you I could hold you responsible for my morality. You got a haircut just like that.
If you did and you want to consume more content like this, then please consider subscribing to.
Yes. We all know. So I have a little bit of time left, and that was one video I wanted to get into. It has been, as far as I can tell, an hour and 15 minutes. And now you see why I didn't make this its own video, because that would take way too long. So the only other piece of housekeeping that we have to get to is this. It is the 10 questions for atheists. So I'm going to do my best to answer these questions in a timely and not rambly fashion, but I will most likely fail. So let's get into it.
The worldview discussions space is so combative. When atheists and Christians come up with lists of questions that they don't think the other side can answer, those questions usually aren't genuine. I've never made a list like that, although I've responded to some. Here, I hope my atheist interlocutors will consider these questions deeply without giving glib answers. These aren't meant to be gotcha questions, though I'm not asking for no reason. I expect you will have answers, and I want to hear what the most sincere among you have to say. With that, here are my 10 questions for atheists.
Let's get it.
What facts about reality that you and I agree are real facts about the way the world is?
I have no idea what facts you agree or know about reality, so I already can't answer this question. If this question is contingent upon our agreement, I don't know what you know and what you accept to be true, so I can't answer it. I don't know anything about you, my dude, so I can't say we agree on these things. I can presumably take reasonable guesses, I guess, but I don't necessarily think that I can answer this question to a sufficient degree.
Does your worldview account for, but my Christianity doesn't account for, or at least doesn't account for well? And for those of you that...
And by account for, you mean what exactly? Because something can account for something in the sense that it has an explanation for it or has a proposed explanation for it, but that doesn't mean that it actually does it. So I can make something up that accounts for something, but that doesn't mean that it's any better. I would rather have a worldview that accurately accounts for less than another worldview that accounts for more in a less accurate way.
Would point out atheism isn't a worldview. I'm talking about your worldview that includes atheism.
Okay, what if I don't have a worldview necessarily? Or what if I don't accept any particular worldview and I take bits and pieces of other worldviews and sort of copy paste them together? I understand what you're trying to get at in the sense of an atheist worldview, not atheism as a worldview, but a worldview that an atheist would have. But the entire point of my channel and my perspective is to come at things from as much of an unbiased perspective as possible, to avoid having a worldview, because that would color my perception of things before actually engaging with them.
I can't think of any. Christianity accounts for evil, suffering, the existence of other religions.
How? How does Christianity account for any of those things?
Including supernatural events in those other religions.
Okay, where? Where does Christianity account for supernatural events in other religions? This is a lot to say, but you kind of have to demonstrate these things, which is why you probably shouldn't say these things in a questions video, because if someone enters the conversation not agreeing with any of this, they can't answer the question.
Science and differences among different denominations of Christianity. But I can think of many things that the most common worldviews that include atheism don't answer as well as I think Christianity does.
Why should I care which worldviews you think answer the questions the best? At least by itself. If you could provide reasons, then we could go back and forth. But just, I can't think of a better worldview doesn't seem like a good reasoning process to me, but you do you.
Like universal supernatural claims, universal religious experiences.
Why can't just science explain that? Why can't just people going through hallucinations, people experiencing some sort of illusion, people just being inaccurate about something? Just because a lot of people say something doesn't make it true. It doesn't matter if it's a universal experience or not. For example, if people watch a magic show, they might have the exact same experience that the magician saw the lady in half. That does not, in fact, mean that they did, in fact, saw the person in half. No matter how universal the experience or the claim is, that has nothing to do with how true it is.
Free will, morality.
I'm not convinced that free will exists. I think morality is subjective in the sense that different people mean different things when they say it, and there is no one overarching meaning because different people mean different things when they say it.
Near-death experiences, beauty.
Now, as far as near-death experiences go, I have not sufficiently researched the subject to speak on that. But I see no valid reason to then accept any particular explanation or account of near-death experiences. If I haven't done the sufficient research and I don't know, which is my current position, why would I choose any particular side? And just because something can give an account for it doesn't mean it's giving a correct one. And shouldn't that be my primary concern?
The rapid expansion of the early church, the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth,
the alleged life and death of Jesus of Nazareth,
and our shared longing for purpose and meaning.
Except for all the people who don't have a longing for purpose and meaning.
So, what is it that Christianity doesn't answer as well as your worldview?
Anything. Quite literally anything. Christianity, as far as I'm aware, and the versions of Christianity that I've come across, raise far more questions than they do answers and don't sufficiently explain anything. Let's take the origin of the universe, for example. God created the universe, says Christianity. How, I say? He spoke it into existence. How, I say? He just did. Jesus walked on water. How, I say? He just did because he has Jesus powers. Jesus, took a loaf of bread and gave it to everybody and it never ran out. How, I say? He has divine powers, they say. What's a divine power? It's a power God has. And do you see how these are not explanations, but they just continuously lead to other questions? An explanation is supposed to give you a good understanding of something. Nothing that Christianity accounts for gives me any deeper of an understanding of anything, regardless whether it's the supernatural miracles or just the natural creation of the universe. None of it is any easier explained to me through Christianity.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God and you're just waiting to be convinced, but then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus.
I would like to point out before you get to this that I am not waiting to be convinced. I'm just living my life and evaluating claims as they come. If I were waiting to be convinced, then I would have some sort of expectation to be convinced, which I don't. I'm interested in the subjects, sure, but I have no particular apprehensions about whether or not I will eventually believe or not.
But then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or fairies. Doesn't that at least send the message to your listeners that you actually believe that there is no God?
No, because the comparison is made via the line of reasoning and not the conclusion. Now, yes, there are some atheists that do that. There are some atheists that compare God to Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny directly to say that God does not exist in the same way that those things do not exist. However, when I bring that up, I am comparing the lines of reasoning. I am saying that the line of reasoning that leads you to believe that Santa Claus exists is roughly similar to the line of reasoning that leads you to believe God exists. The inability to explain any of the features surrounding God is the same. Santa Claus just has a magic sleigh. How does the magic sleigh work? How does it fly? Oh, the reindeers can fly. How can the reindeers fly? They have wings? No, they don't have wings. How do they fly? Magic. How does Santa Claus cover the entire earth in a single night and every home without ever stopping or without ever having to feed them or any of that within a 24-hour period, especially when different places are in different time zones? Well, he just does it. And God seems to function in the same way. So if I compare the two, that is to say, my understanding of God or my understanding of the evidence that demonstrates God's existence is akin to my understanding of the evidence that demonstrates the existence of Santa Claus. My line of reasoning for both is the same, not to say that I know for a fact they do not exist, but merely to say I'm not convinced on both of these things.
After all,
Or to say that the explanations that I've been given thus far are the same in that they seem contradictory and ridiculous and don't make sense. I will more often compare a person's line of reasoning to God, or compare a person's line of reasoning for why God exists to their line of reasoning for why Santa Claus exists, as opposed to comparing God himself to Santa Claus himself.
these are entities and beings that you likely believe do not exist.
I do not believe these things exist, but again, this depends on the definition. So, the most common understanding of the Easter Bunny as a bunny that gives out eggs is, as far as I can tell, not true. Not only is there no sufficient evidence for it, there isn't even a decent understanding of how such a thing would work, how a bunny could get to that conclusion. And I know that doesn't make it 100% super ultimate 1000% false, but that's not the degree of falsehood that most people are looking for. Most people are just looking for something that does not map with reality and is inconsistent with reality. A giant bunny giving out eggs on one particular day is not consistent with reality. One man going all over the world and giving all of the children presents or coal, depending on their behavior, is not consistent with reality. And especially in the latter case, that can be observed. You can just wait on Christmas Day and Santa Claus will never come. And you can do that multiple years in a row to test if it's just 1 year he was off. And we can actually test some of the claims of these two things because they are in some way physical. And if they are in some way physical, there is some sort of physical evidence that we can expect would be there. But we can't find any. And when it comes to both Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, the evidence we would expect to be there isn't there. That line of reasoning is the same with God, at least as far as I can tell. Any evidence that we would expect, depending on your definition of God, to be there isn't there. But like I said, that depends on your definition. So,
And if your response is that you merely lack a belief in Santa Claus and don't actively believe that he does not exist, doesn't that sound a little disingenuous, honestly?
why would you think that sounds disingenuous? I am the one that has my beliefs or lack thereof. So why are you questioning me? Now, I might act as if those things don't exist, but acting as if they don't exist and actively believing they do not exist is not the same thing. If I don't know about someone coming to kill me, that doesn't mean I actively know for a fact no one is coming to kill me. That just means I'm unaware. So I don't see any reason for you to assume that's disingenuous because I don't even know. You didn't even provide a reason as to why that would be disingenuous. You just say it might be disingenuous.
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their positions on other issues like abortion, sexual morality, and a number of other things.
Okay, citation, please.
I actually have several videos of well-known atheists saying that there's nothing wrong with prostitution, that they hope their children don't save themselves until marriage, and that sex workers should be put up on a pedestal no different than the military.
Okay, but do you have videos of these people before their conversions and then after their conversions or after their deconversions? And then how do you attribute their changes to the deconversion specifically as opposed to any other thing that might have been going on in their life? I see no valid reason for you to imply that the deconversion is causing the change when you could just as easily say the change causes the deconversion if we're just not going to provide evidence or reasons.
I didn't use those here because I didn't want to seem combative to individuals, specifically the individuals who made those statements.
You did not cite your sources because you thought that it would be combative to do so. Okay. But I will point out that just because you found some prominent atheists saying things only means that you found some prominent atheists saying things. I don't think that's any grounds to take that and apply that to anyone else other than the person who said the thing.
But even if you didn't become an atheist just so you could sin, and I believe you, do you at least understand why those moves could send that message to people who might say that to you?
No, I don't. Because if I became an atheist, presumably most of the time, atheists don't believe in that concept of sin because that concept of sin is usually tied to a religion that believes in a God. And while it's entirely possible for them to dump God and keep the rest of the religion, that usually tends not to be the case. So I see no valid reason to think that I don't see how someone could come to that conclusion. I do not understand why someone would think that I became an atheist just to sin, especially when there are Christians who sin and admit that they sin and continue to sin. There are Christians who hold similar positions regarding things like sex workers or what have you. That does not mean that they are, saying that because they want to sin. You can hold controversial positions on sex work or topics like that without actually engaging with it at all. Or is it the mere act of saying that you support this thing, the same thing as engaging with it and sinning? I see no valid reason why sinning is tied in any way to the concept of, or I don't see any reason why allowing oneself to sin is a consequence or an intended consequence of deconversion. Because if I believed in sin, then presumably I would believe in the religion tied to it and it's God. And if I believed in that God, how would I be an atheist? Whether I was a Christian or whether I was an atheist or whether I was some other thing, I don't care about sin because A, that means different things to different people, and B, I don't see it having any kind of pragmatic effect on the world.
If it's a lack of belief sort of atheism, what is it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 75-25?
It is quite literally a giant question mark. I cannot calculate the probabilities because I do not understand what is being said. So there's a whole other separate video I'm planning to make on this, but I identify as an igtheist, or a theological non-cognitivist if you want to be fancy. But I don't understand theological claims about supernatural or about the supernatural, the immaterial, the spiritual, the divine. None of that makes any sense to me. And I simply don't believe that we have enough of an understanding on any of these concepts to discuss the matter and actually come to a conclusion of yes or no. I simply am not convinced because I do not understand. And because I do not understand, I can't calculate the probabilities of it being 25, 75, 50, 50, 90, 10, whatever. I can't come to those statistics because I don't even understand what we're calculating.
And at what point do you feel disingenuous saying that you merely lack a belief as opposed to leaning towards, I believe that God does not exist?
At no point do I feel disingenuous because I try to uphold my own intellectual honesty and be honest with myself about what I know, what I don't know, what I understand, what I don't understand, and what I believe and what I don't believe, which is why I try not to say things that I can't substantiate or things that I don't know are true, and try to be incredibly specific in my language and say things like, in my experience, or to the best of my knowledge, or as far as I am aware, rather than just saying things or facts. I say these things with the context of I could be wrong and or I don't know, because that's honestly genuinely my perspective. I don't know what a god is supposed to be, how it's supposed to function, how it's supposed to exist. And I don't know if there is a point that I could be disingenuous about that.
Now, I know we've all got our talking points, but I want you to struggle to be as sincere with yourself as you can right now. Doesn't it bother you a little bit that when we come to talk about the origins of the universe, and if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible, or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or something far less clear than even those?
I'm not convinced that those are the only options, because that third option is just kind of like any other option you could think of. But no, that doesn't bother me, and I see no valid reason why it would bother me, because my position on that is the same as my position on God. I don't know. I don't have a decent enough understanding of the Big Bang Theory to say, yes, that 100% happened. It is my understanding that that is scientific consensus and it is most generally accepted as fact, and that there is not or has not been sufficient evidence to the contrary as of yet, but I don't know. And at the end of the day, that's the answer that we're going to keep coming back to a lot when we come to these questions is I don't know. And I'm okay with that. I see no valid reason why I need to have an answer for everything, because that need to have an answer for everything will cause me inevitably to disregard the truth of that answer, because I'll be more concerned with having an answer rather than having a true answer. So my concern is having a true answer, and I would rather have no answer at all than to have a false answer, at least until I can prove that the answer isn't false.
It seems that for any worldview that includes atheism, there's a massive blind spot when it comes to the origin of the universe. And all the attempts to try...
Oh, that's right. He said something important. I want to go back for a second. Let me go back and let me see.
Far less clear than even coming, if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible.
Why is that impossible? If time is created at the Big Bang, then there's no time before that. So any rules about time don't apply. Also, it is my understanding that Christianities, or that there are Christians who have a conception of God as timeless. If God can be timeless, why can't past universes be timeless in a past sense? Why can't time just not have begun at the Big Bang? Why couldn't time just go back infinitely? Why can't it be turtles all the way down? You say it's impossible, but you don't really explain why. You kind of just say it is. And this is the problem when you're making a questions video for people who disagree with you. We're not going to merely grant that point. We're going to inquire, why is it impossible?
Or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or...
I get the distinct impression that you don't have a problem with the universe coming out of nothing as long as God makes it come out of nothing, which is better, I guess. But for some reason, that's a problem for me, or it's supposed to bother me in some sense when I don't know why it would. This is the thing. Reality functions the way it functions, regardless of whether or not it makes me comfortable and regardless of whether or not I can understand it. So if the objective fact of the matter comes to be that the universe did come into existence uncaused out of nothing, then that merely is the way it is, and it just doesn't bother me. At the end of the day, I don't let facts bother me, because then I am more concerned with how bothered I am than with the facts themselves.
Something far less clear than even those. It seems that for any worldview that includes atheism, there's a massive blind spot when it comes to the origin of the universe. And all the attempts to try and circumvent that problem seem desperate and at least far less likely than theism.
I don't know how you determine the desperation of an explanation. And I also don't know how you determine the likelihood of the explanation versus Christianity. So, how do you determine the likelihood of a universe coming into existence out of nothing versus the likelihood of a God bringing it into existence out of nothing? How do you calculate that? Where do you get your statistics from? Where do you get your probabilities from? Because I don't even know what it would mean to calculate those things, but apparently you've calculated those things and determined that it's less likely than Christianity. How? I can't answer this question sufficiently until I get a better answer, until I get a more sufficient understanding of what you're talking about. And to whatever extent I can answer it, no, it doesn't bother me because I'm okay with saying I don't know.
My question isn't just what do you typically say about this, because I'm well aware of the responses. My question is simply this. When you step away from the debate mode that it's so easy for us all to get into online, doesn't this issue destabilize you a little bit?
No, why would it?
It seems to fit really poorly with any worldview that includes atheism.
Whether or not an idea fits with a worldview isn't necessarily relevant to me. No, go away. Stop showing the people that I follow. Anyway, whether or not an issue destabilizes me isn't particularly relevant because it's going to be true or it's not going to be true. And that is my primary concern. And I don't let anything deviate. And I try my best not to let anything skew me from that goal. So, no, it doesn't destabilize me that I don't know. And I don't know does not have any contradiction or conflict with my worldview, whatever that may be, because I'm willing to admit that I don't know. And if it did conflict with my worldview, I would disregard the worldview if the thing was true and that truth conflicted with the worldview.
Of the arguments for God's existence, is there one that to you seems more interesting than the rest?
There is one that seems more interesting, and it's always the design argument, because the design argument is not actually a design argument, or the complexity argument is not actually a complexity argument, because the fundamental premise of the watchmaker depends on you knowing what a watch is. It depends on you knowing what the thing is, because if you don't know what the thing is, you can come to no conclusion on how complex it is or isn't. And that's not even taking into account that complex depends on who you talk to, and different people have different definitions of what's complex. Some people find a light complex in how it illuminates everything. Some people find the sun complex, but some people think that the sun is just relatively simple, as it's just a ball of light in the sky, whereas the universe is really complex. And even then, these things are not all comparable, and you can't just compare one thing you think is complex to another thing you think is complex and say they're functionally the same and therefore had similar sources because they're both complex, whatever that even is supposed to mean. So yes, the complexity argument is the one. The complexity argument slash watchmaker slash design argument is the one I find most interesting, because it's the one that has the most obviously glaring problem of you need to know what the thing is, and people just don't address that. So that's the one I find most interesting.
Is there one that for you actually does weigh in favor of theism? Which one?
No, I don't understand what it would mean for arguments that I am not convinced by to weigh more or less in favor. All of the arguments are equally bad in the sense that they are just not accurate and or make no sense to me. I don't know how I would categorize it and say this one's better but still not good enough, and this one's also better but this one's not good enough, and this one's not as good but still not good enough. I don't know how I would categorize them. They're all not convincing, and I don't know how I rank or make a tier list of unconvincing arguments.
Most atheists I've met humbly admit that they don't think they can have absolute certainty about much of anything. But what
I'm not convinced I understand what absolute certainty even is, or why it would even be a good thing to have.
they want from the Christian is a demonstration that God exists or that Christianity is true. Well, when we offer the reasons to believe that we do have, those are typically deemed not good enough?
Because reasons are not demonstrations. If I ask you to show me your girlfriend, then you give me a bunch of reasons of why you have a girlfriend, and you show me some text messages, and you show me some pictures, and you show me, and you try to call somebody. That is, well, the call might be a demonstration, but those other things are reasons and not demonstrations in and of themselves. If I ask you to demonstrate that you can perform an activity, giving me reasons why you could do it is not the same as actually demonstrating it. If I ask you to run or demonstrate that you can run, and you say, well, I have legs and they seem like they can work, that's not the same thing as you demonstrating the activity of running or demonstrating that you ran at any particular point in time. So reasons are not the same thing as demonstrations. They can be, but they are not necessarily the same.
So what sort of evidence, if any, would be enough to convince you?
I don't know, because I don't know what a God is, so I can't say what kind of evidence would convince me or not. All I can tell you is why certain arguments don't make sense to me, why they're unconvincing, what inconsistencies I see them having, why I find them just not to be very persuasive. That's all I can do. I have no understanding of what would convince me, because I don't even understand what the claim is, and that's usually what the conversation is about. And since we usually, or at least thus far, have not been able to get to a concise, clear, this is what God is supposed to be, since we haven't gotten to that point, or I have not gotten to that point with any believer, theist, then I simply don't know what would be enough to convince me.
Do you know? And since it's often a conversation stopper, let's take experimental reproducibility off the table, since that's not even always necessary for science.
Experimental reproducibility meaning what? You haven't explained what it is, so again, I don't know how we take it off the table. I think what you're trying to say is what I was talking about when I was talking with the previous video, in the sense that if the variables are exactly the same, you should be able to get the exact same result every single time. I don't know how we take that out of the equation, and I don't understand why you would take that out of the equation. So I'm just confused, as usual.
To what extent did social and moral issues start you down the path toward your atheism? That is to say, the typical Christian or religious views on sexuality, gender, rights, and acts and commands of God in the Old Testament. It seems that many deconversion stories online begin with, or at least include, LGBT issues, purity culture, or hell as instrumental in the deconversion process. It strikes me that what should matter most is the truth and not what we might prefer that the truth were. I honestly wonder how much those issues and ones like them motivate the deconversion rather than all this talk about evidence.
My deconversion had nothing to do with social issues, and it had everything to do with an inability to understand what the claim was and coming to realize I had that inability at the time. So there is no extent to which these social issues impact my conversion or deconversion, because each issue needs to be evaluated on its own. And like you said, the truth of the matter is my primary focus. Any conclusion I came to on any of those other issues has nothing to do with whether or not I believe in God, because I think those are separate and distinct issues. So whether or not I think LGBT people should be allowed to marry and have specific legal protections and things of that nature has nothing to do with whether or not I believe in a God. Because even if I didn't believe in a God, I wouldn't then just base the rest of my opinions on that. Each issue has to be evaluated, and its truth value needs to be assessed on its own. If I let one issue just determine all the others, then what's the point in evaluating? What's the point in investigating? So to answer the question, there is no real connection. Any particular opinions I have on social issues or things like that are conclusions that I have come to on my own, separate of this discussion. My deconversion, if you could call it that, had nothing to do with social issues or things like that. And any opinions that I had before I deconverted were on social issues were the same opinions I had after I deconverted, because the deconversion didn't suddenly change my opinion.
name the last 3 academic books you read by theists on the subject?
No. Can you name the last 3 academic books you read by neo-Nazis on the subject? I see no valid reason that I should have to in that I should have to dive into mountains and mountains and mountains of Christian, Muslim, Jewish literature. Because if I have to do that for Christianity, I have to do that for all religions. And it's just straight up not very pragmatic and reasonable to expect me to do hours of research on every religion possible. I have a life to live. I have physical needs that need to be met. I need to work. I need to make money. I need a house over my head, things like that. So, no, I haven't read any particular biblical scholars or literature or things of that nature, but I don't think it's necessary. I think you can look at the reasons people present you with and evaluate those reasons as not good enough and continue on with your life rather than everything requires mountains and mountains of research right now.
How long ago did you read them? Or is most of your understanding of apologetics and atheism from non-scholarly internet sources, pop-level books, and, face it, YouTube videos?
Like yours? Are you telling me I shouldn't watch your videos because they don't give an accurate representation of Christianity? Here's the thing. Most Christians, as far as I'm aware, do not come to their Christianity nor support their Christianity based on scholarly sources. In most churches, congregations, things of that nature, they don't go over their scholarly sources when they're reading the Bible. They just read the Bible. And I don't deny that there are a significant amount of Christians that do, but the vast majority don't. And if those are the people that I'm trying to have a conversation with, then it's a waste of time to go through all those scholarly sources. It's a waste of time for me to go into all of William Lane Craig's evidence if the person I'm having a conversation with doesn't even know who William Lane Craig is. So, no, I haven't read, well, I have not read to a sufficient degree a vast majority of Christian scholarly sources, but I don't find it necessary because I can evaluate the ideas on their own and they either stand or fall on their own merit without regard to whether or not they're scholarly.
And be honest with yourself about this. Anyone can Google up a list of books and paste them in the comments section. But I want to know, are you getting the best from the other side?
I don't know. I have no way of evaluating what is the best from the other side, and I see no valid reason to believe that the scholarly sources will be better than the non-scholarly sources. Lots of people can be scholarly and wrong. This is why the difference between science and pseudoscience is so important. They can both appear scholarly, but that doesn't mean that they are. And you can find a lot of scholarly flat earth sources if you really tried, but that wouldn't make them any more correct. So I don't care about how scholarly something is. I care about the arguments as they are presented to me in real time. Unless you expect me to go through every religion and evaluate all of the religions and find the best arguments for all of the religions before coming to any sort of opinion on them, which is just unreasonable. Unless you have that kind of time and money and resources, because I don't.
Let's finish with a pretty common one. If you found out today to your satisfaction that Christianity were true, would you accept God's authority, repent of your sins, and trust Jesus as your king?
Absolutely not. As far as I am aware, I have no good reason to do so. Even if Christianity is true to a T and Jesus died to save my sins, I have far too many questions and far too much of a lack of an understanding to just commit my life to these things that I don't know. Even if it was shown to a sufficient degree and I knew what a God was and I would have to know how a God did the things that they did, none of that implies that I should then give my life over to Jesus. If anything, I would still have questions. Why does the system function in the way that it does? Why do I have to give my life up to Jesus as opposed to Jesus just Thanosing sin? Why can't Jesus just get rid of sin and get rid of the problem at its root? Why do I have to make a commitment to him to tell other people so that they can be saved by him? Why can't he just save everyone and be done with it? Why can't God just banish Satan to a different dimension and be done with it? I see no valid reason why my commitment to Christianity is important or valuable at all. So, no, I wouldn't. And that's not even counting the fact that there are things in the Bible which, if true, I have problems with, like Noah's flood, the time God just decided to kill everyone and everything. I'm not going to fall to my knees and repent of my sins to someone willing to commit planetary genocide under any circumstances, especially not when I don't even know why they allow the system to function in the way that they do when they don't have to. Well, that was fun, and I went a little bit over my 10-minute mark, but that's okay. At the end of the day, that was the goal, was to just address these two videos in as much time as possible, and it took about 2 hours like I thought it would, but at the end of the day, I got them out. I've moved on, and if anyone wants to see my opinions on the best argument for God's existence or these particular 10 questions, I can refer them to the stream. There are no viewers at the moment, so no one's watching this, but hopefully someone will come across this in the future and gain some insight from it. Before I go, I just want to clarify something that I want to start saying in every video, which is form your own opinions. Don't just watch the stream and believe me. Don't just watch anything and believe it. Come to your own opinions and question everything, including everything that I say. Always be skeptical. And until next time, remember, I appreciate you a lot.